can we explore these bizarre events in South Korea? What, in your view, is the significance of this 6-hour declaration of martial law? And what, if anything, was the reaction of the American embassy and American troops in South Korea?
I think it's a good thing to stop and consider what did happen in the Republic of Korea. The Republic of Korea is treated in the United States as essentially a military colony of U.S. imperial interest and influence. We don't really treat South Korea as a truly sovereign state. And that's because we have certain agreements that give us effectively military control of the entire peninsula. Now, the man that was responsible for the martial law is President Yoon. President Yoon came to power a few years ago after a very, very tight election. In fact, it was razor thin, his margin of victory. And at the time, there were rumors that the CIA had played a significant role behind the scenes in helping him to achieve a victory. The losing party was the Liberal Nationalist Party. And the Liberal Nationalists have been trying to chart a course toward independence from Washington and true national sovereignty. And one of the first things they wanted to do was appoint a Korean 4-star as the commander-in-chief of all forces on the peninsula. That's something that I argued for in 1997 in my book, Breaking the Phalanx. And as a result, they brought me over in 2010 to examine what the implications would be if they became independent and how they would go about restructuring their armed forces. This all, of course, was anathema to a series of U.S. administrations who have continued to try and work hard and keep Korea, so to say, under the thumb. I think there was a brief moment with President Trump when he was willing to see things differently. But once he left office, they elected a new president in Korea, and this man was could have been handpicked for all intents and purposes by the CIA, who knows. But he's widely regarded in Korea as a colonial lackey. He knows now, several years later after he was elected, that there is no chance for his party to win any future election. Now, his party is currently called the People's Power Party. Prior to that, it was the Grand National Party. It's had several names, but it's effectively the facade behind which the United States orchestrates events on the Korean Peninsula politically. So he saw what was happening with the electorate. The electorate was turning decisively against him and his policies. Now, one of the things that came up for discussion was this insistence that there were North Koreans in Ukraine fighting. And we know there are none. That's just a bold-faced lie. But he and his intelligence services, and his intelligence service is almost an appendage of the CIA, argued that, well, since North Koreans are fighting for the Russians, we Koreans should be fighting in Ukraine for the Ukrainians. Well, that did not go over well. Most Koreans didn't really believe the North Koreans were there, but whether or not they are, they took the position that they don't want to go. They don't think Koreans should fight anywhere in the world outside of Asia, and certainly, for all intents and purposes, not outside of Korea. So he's in a very weakened position. He decided that he would declare martial law because, in addition to the leadership of the intelligence services, he has the backing of the military, the Korean military, because most of the top generals are effectively, what's the right word? I guess you could call them lackeys of the U.S. Armed Forces for all intents and purposes. Now, all of this did not go as planned. But what's really interesting about this attempt to declare martial law and set himself up as a dictator is effectively what we've seen happen in Ukraine with Zelensky. He's made himself a dictator with our backing. This is what Yoon wanted to do. But the Korean people would have nothing to do with it. And the parliament itself rebelled. And he does not have a majority in parliament at all. He's a minority party in the parliament. And the parliament said, no martial law, we will lift it immediately. The Korean military was reluctant to act. They did stir a bit. It looked like they might intervene in parliament, but then that did not happen. because there was so much public opposition to the notion of martial law, since there was no requirement for it. There's no emergency that would justify it under any circumstances. At the same time, our government doesn't seem to have spoken about it publicly, but seems to have known about it. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the U.S. government and its ambassador in Seoul, along with the U.S. forces there, essentially the leadership, may have been standing on the sidelines, waiting for this to happen and assisting in any way they could. In other words, this was something that we potentially would have welcomed as solidifying our continued control over the peninsula.
How many American troops are in South Korea, Colonel?
About 26 to 27,000.
And it is your view that the head of the CIA station in Seoul, the United States ambassador, and whoever's in charge of those 27 or 28,000 troops knew that this coup was going to take place, attempted coup?
Yeah, I'm quite certain they did. And Ambassador Goldberg, has been an ambassador twice before and was linked to attempts to essentially replace the legitimately elected government with a government that was, let us say, conformed to our interests strategically. So Korea has no interest in becoming another Ukraine, and the Korean people stood up against this and stopped it. And I think this is another manifestation of the kind of thing that you see at the quote end of empire. As the empire crumbles, the people that have been living within the empire recognize that they can strike out on their own. This was an attempt to prevent that. So this President Yoon probably will face impeachment or worse, may well end up in prison. As president of Korea, he's not like a president of the United States. He doesn't have per se a vice president. Some form of deputy will step in. But in Korea, the prime minister is really the second person in line to govern the country, and that's the person in the parliament. So the president of Korea is more or less an elected Khan or king or emperor. I say Khan because that word is probably the most descriptive one for Korean politics. Whatever the president
Khan as in, you mean Khan as in Khan job?
No, I mean Khan as in Genghis Khan.
Oh, K-A-H-N. Pardon me. I have to tell you, Colonel, I am ignorant of the ironclad grip, as you describe it, that the American military and CIA have on South Korea, to the point where you have characterized it as not truly an independent or sovereign nation. I guess it's been that way since the so-called armistice between North and South.
Exactly. And a lot of people were very, very excited when President Trump came into office in 2017. And one of the first things that President Moon at that point, this was the liberal nationalist, raised with President Trump was, we'd like to have control of our forces on the peninsula. In other words, we're not asking you to leave per se, but we really think a Korean four-star should be responsible for the defense of Korean national territory, airspace, and waters. And President Trump was completely unaware that that was not already the case. And so there was some hope for a brief period that might actually happen. And if you go back to the discussions in Hanoi that involved the denuclearization of North Korea, that ultimately President Trump did not sign, unfortunately, that was all aimed at creating the conditions for a peaceful unification. But like everything in Asia, it's a slow, ponderous process that takes many years. That's the nature of Asian civilization, or I should say Confucian civilization. Nothing happens quickly. And that's by design, because the populations don't want chaos. They want order. That didn't happen. And now we have a clear mandate from the population that says, we don't want to be America's imperial lackey anymore. So this man Yoon has opened Pandora's box for himself, and I think also for the United States armed forces that are there in the country and for U.S. interests.
Do you think that the American officials who are responsible for this ironclad grip, whether it's CIA, fill in the blank, whoever that person is, or the head of the U.S. troops there, or even Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan, were aware of the coup and wanted it to happen?
Well, first of all, I don't know with absolute certainty that they wanted it to happen. I find it hard to believe that they weren't aware of it. They may not have paid much attention to it. You know, Washington, sadly, Judge, is pretty much a one crisis, one conflict town. It's never been very good at managing multiple crises and conflicts. So I think a lot of things have probably slipped through over the last several years because of events in Ukraine, and now increasingly because of what's happening in the Middle East. The key thing is this: the United States is behaving in most ways like reactionary Austria did after the Napoleonic Wars. Everything that happens after 1815 in Austria is about keeping things under control, maintaining the status quo. That's really what we are about. When we talk about this post-war international liberal order, or whatever they want to call it, the truth is it's an order that favors us, and we're interested in maintaining it and preserving it. And we are on the verge of, I would say, world war to try and keep it as it is. And that's not going to work. It didn't work for Austria-Hungary when it went to war in 1914, and it's not going to work for us. But Korea is just another example of where we are going to do whatever we can to avoid change in any form. We want to remain in control.